The room smells like rust and money, cold concrete walls, exposed pipes running the length of the ceiling. One bulb, just one, hanging on a bare wire above a steel table that hasn't been cleaned in years. And on the floor, already on his knees, is Kalen Rive. He's been dragged here by two men who didn't bother learning his name. They know only what they were told. Mute Omega. Disposable. A loose end from the lower trade networks that needed to be tied off before the meeting started. Nobody in this room cares who he is. That's the first mistake they make. The second mistake is sitting directly across from him. Draxen Viral leans back in his chair like a man who has never once feared a room in his entire life. Dark eyes, jaw cut like stone. The kind of stillness that only comes from a man who knows every person in this space would bleed before he ever would. He is the eldest of the three Viral brothers, the most feared alpha in the Northern Syndicate territories. A name that ends arguments before they start. His two brothers, Zoran and Cavil, stand flanking the walls, arms crossed, watching. 20 armed men fill the rest of the room. Nobody speaks. Nobody has to. Kalen keeps his eyes low, head slightly down. He's learned over the years that stillness keeps you alive. That looking too long at the wrong man's face costs you. He breathes in slow through his nose, and he counts. The men by the door. The distance from the table to the drain in the floor. The exact position of every pair of boots he can see from his position on the ground. Old habit. Survival habit. Draxen exhales slowly and reaches for the glass of water on the table beside him. That's when Kalen hears it. A sound. Small. Almost nothing. A barely there metallic tick. Like a thin wire being pulled taut by weight shifting. Kalen's eyes move without his head moving. Down. Along the floor. Then up slowly along the leg of the steel table. He sees it. A tension wire. Thin as fishing line. Running beneath the waistband of Draxen's belt. Looped through a micro-anchor on the table's underside. And connected by a thread-thin cable to a flat pressure trigger mounted flush against the table frame. A bomb. Not a large one. You'd never find it by looking at the room. You wouldn't feel it unless you knew where to press. But it was there, and it had been placed by someone who understood exactly how these meetings were run. Someone who knew Draxen always sat in the same chair, always leaned forward at some point in the conversation. The moment he stood up, the release mechanism would snap, and this basement and everyone inside it would be gone. Hi viewers. Have you ever been in a situation where you noticed something important that everyone else completely missed, and had to decide in a split second whether to speak up or stay silent? Kalen breathes. Once. Slow. He doesn't look up. He doesn't signal. He doesn't write anything on the floor. He simply leans forward, the way a man might lean forward when he's been told to do something humiliating, and he moves his hands toward Draxen's belt. The room reacts instantly. Weapons click. Two guards step forward. Someone shouts a single hard syllable. But Draxen raises one hand, one finger up, and the entire room freezes. He looks down at the silent Omega with something that isn't anger and isn't curiosity but sits exactly between the two. Let him. Kalen's fingers find the wire. It's connected at 3 points. He can feel the microtension in each one. The kind of setup that would spring the trigger if you pulled too fast or applied pressure from the wrong angle. This wasn't a street explosive. This was precision work. He starts at the first anchor point. His hands don't shake. The room watches in complete silence. And slowly, loop by loop, the wire begins to slip free. Then Kalen's fingers pause. Because he feels something that stops his entire body cold. The wire doesn't only run to the table. There's a second line, thinner than the first, running horizontally across the floor, toward the boots of someone already standing in this room. Someone who came in with the others. Someone who was supposed to be on the same side. The trigger is connected to a person. And if Kalen pulls the wrong wire, that person activates it manually. Which means the bomber is already inside. Which means they are already watching. which means they know exactly what Kalen has just found. If you were in Kalen's position, would you keep going? Or would you stop and find another way? Drop your answer in the comments. Chapter 2 is coming, and what Kalen does next changes everything. Kalen does not stop moving. That's the only choice that keeps him alive. His fingers stay on the wire, slow and steady, while his mind works at a different speed entirely. He doesn't look up. He doesn't look toward the boots connected to the second line. He keeps his breathing flat, in through the nose, out through the mouth, barely a sound, and he lets his hands do what they've always known how to do. Find the pattern. Follow the thread. Don't rush it, because Kalen Rive has spent his entire life surviving rooms that wanted him dead. He was 8 years old the first time his father set a disarmed circuit board in front of him on the kitchen table. No instructions. Just a cup of tea going cold on the counter and a long silence while the man waited to see what his son would do. Kalen had picked it up, turned it, found the relay point in under 2 minutes. His father had nodded once and said nothing. That was the whole lesson. His father spent 30 years as a forensic intelligence analyst, a man who read scenes the way other people read sentences. He worked contract work for 3 federal agencies whose names he never said out loud, and he raised his son inside the same discipline. Observation first, reaction second, assumption never. Kalen lost his voice when he was 11. An infection that moved too fast, treated too late. When he came out of the hospital, the world had changed. People looked at him differently, shorter, somehow. Like losing his voice had made him smaller in their eyes. His father was the only person who treated him exactly the same. Being quiet doesn't make you less, he said. It makes you dangerous. Kalen understood that later. Much later. After his father was gone, and the people who came next saw only what they wanted to see. A silent Omega who couldn't fight back, couldn't call for help, couldn't argue when they handed him over to the trade networks. They were wrong about all of it. Back in the basement, Kalen reaches the second anchor point. His fingers test the tension. He feels the line. It runs under the edge of a floor mat along the baseboard and connects somewhere behind him. He doesn't turn around to look. He tracks it by pressure alone. Soft resistance. Slack in the middle. The person holding the other end is trying to look relaxed. They're not. Kalen works the first wire free from its anchor. It releases with 0 sound. He folds it back along the belt, removing the tension from the table mount, and then very carefully slides the pressure trigger sideways until its clip disengages from the frame. It drops to the floor. Not a clang. A whisper of metal on concrete. For a moment, nothing happens. Then the room erupts. Not loudly, these are professional men. But they move. Guards sweep the walls. 2 of Draxon's lieutenants draw and begin scanning faces. Zoran steps away from the wall, eyes cutting across the room in a tight grid pattern. A voice calls out, "Check the exits." Boots move fast across concrete. But Draxon doesn't move at all. He looks down at Kalen. Not the way a man looks at property. The way a man looks at something he doesn't yet have a word for. Kalen stays on the floor. He doesn't stand. Doesn't gesture. He keeps his hands visible, both palms slightly open, and he holds Draxon's gaze for exactly 1 second before looking back down. The chaos in the room continues around them like weather. But between the 2 of them, it's completely still. Draxon leans forward, slowly, deliberately, and he speaks in a low voice that carries no heat and no noise. "How did you know?" The room doesn't fully hear it. A few men glance over, but the search is pulling attention in every other direction. Kalen doesn't answer. He can't. He holds Draxon's gaze for a moment longer, then looks down once, toward the floor where the wire fell. Then he lifts his eyes to the second line still running along the baseboard. One look, just one, and Draxon follows it. His eyes move across the room slowly. He says nothing. His expression doesn't change, but his hand moves to the ring on his right finger, a slow, deliberate rotation that his brothers both clock instantly. Their signal. Nobody leaves this room. Kalen watches it all from the floor, silent and still, while 20 armed men search the room for an attacker who is already standing among them. Kalen points without pointing. That's the only way to describe it. He doesn't extend a finger toward the man. He doesn't write anything. He doesn't make a scene. He tilts his chin barely toward Draxon's belt, then raises his gaze to the exposed ceiling beam directly overhead. 3 tiny movements. Belt, table, beam. The line from each one draws itself. Draxon follows it like a map he didn't know he was reading. His eyes travel the route, from the belt anchor to the underside of the table frame, then upward along the vertical pipe bolted to the wall, then across the ceiling to the beam where a small black mount is screwed flush into the wood. If you weren't looking for it, you'd never see it. It looks like a standard pipe bracket. It is not. Draxon stares at it for 4 seconds. Then he exhales through his nose. Not anger. Something colder than anger. Understanding. This wasn't a rush job. Someone hadn't snuck in at the last minute and planted something sloppy under the table. The mount in the ceiling beam had been placed there during a prior access window, which meant someone with legitimate entry to this building had planned this over days, maybe longer. The trigger mechanism was pressure release, not remote detonated, which meant no signal could be traced. No phone, no frequency, nothing to intercept. Whoever built this knew exactly how Draxon's security team swept rooms. They built around it. Draxon stands up slowly from the chair. The room immediately goes still. Lock the doors. For words. The exits seal in under 10 seconds. Guards move into position without a single additional command. This is a team that has run this protocol before, not often, but enough that the muscle memory is real. Nobody panics. Nobody asks questions. The doors close and the room becomes a sealed box. 22 people inside. One of them placed that device. Draxon walks to the center of the room. He doesn't pace. He doesn't raise his voice. He stands completely still with his hands clasped in front of him, and he looks at every face in the room. One by one, the way a man reads a room that might cost him everything. Cavill moves to the far wall and activates the camera kill switch. No recordings from this point forward. Zoran begins a quiet secondary sweep of the room perimeter, and Kalen remains on the floor. He watches, because watching is what he does. And while the guards check corners and Draxon holds the center and the room searches for an answer it cannot find, Kalen is reading something entirely different. He's reading faces. Specifically, he's reading reactions. When the device was found, there were 2 kinds of faces in that room. Faces that went sharp with alarm. Eyes wide, jaw tight, the genuine physical response of a man who just learned someone tried to blow up his boss. And then one face that went the other direction. Slightly slack. Eyes dropping for just a fraction of a second before pulling back up. Not fear. Not surprise. Relief. The kind of relief that is immediately suppressed, immediately buried under a performance of controlled concern, but that shows up in the half-second before the performance kicks in. In the jaw loosening, the shoulders dropping, the breath going out. The bomb didn't go off, and someone in this room had expected it to. Kalen doesn't move toward the man, doesn't look directly at him. He keeps his gaze low and his body still, and he waits, because patience is another skill his father taught him. The search continues for another 3 minutes. Nothing is found. The room settles into a tight, coiled tension. Everyone watching everyone else without appearing to watch. And then Kalen moves. One small, deliberate motion. He reaches out and picks up a small metal bolt from the concrete floor. One of dozens that have rolled around this basement over years of use. He holds it between 2 fingers for a moment. Then he rolls it slowly across the floor, travels 6 feet and stops. Right beside the polished dress shoes of one man. A man who does not belong to the syndicate's armed units. A man in a tailored charcoal suit who came in with credentials from the Virile Financial Division. A corporate representative. The bolt sits there, small and quiet, against the toe of his left shoe. Draxen sees it. His eyes travel from the bolt to the shoe to the man. And the man, just for a moment, stops breathing. The corporate advisor's name is Prescott Hale. That detail surfaces in the room's memory in real time. Men glancing at one another as the recognition lands, the kind of quiet recognition that happens when a name you trusted suddenly means something different. Prescott Hale. 22 years working adjacent to the virile financial structure. Known inside the organization as cautious, precise, politically neutral. A man who showed up at every major meeting and said very little and left no visible footprint. Which, Kalen understood, had always been the point. The bolt sits beside Prescott's shoe. Nobody moves for 3 full seconds. Then Prescott moves first, and the room explodes. He doesn't reach for a weapon. He runs. Straight toward the maintenance corridor on the east wall. A door he clearly already knew was there, that he'd already mapped out as his exit, because men like Prescott Hale do not walk into rooms they can't walk out of. The door is heavy-gauge steel with a magnetic lock, but the lock has already been disengaged from the inside, which means this exit was staged before the meeting began. Kalen sees it all happen in a kind of slow compression, the way high-stakes moments always feel when you've been trained to observe rather than react. Prescott hits the door. Gunshots crack against the far wall. 2 guards close the distance fast, but they're half a second late, and the maintenance corridor swallows Prescott whole before anyone can get a clean line on him. The door slams. The room goes into controlled chaos. 3 men running after him, radios activating, Zoran moving toward the tactical panel. Voices layer on top of each other. Commands and response. The sound of boots against concrete. Draxen doesn't move. He stands in the center of the room and watches the chaos the way a man watches weather. Fully aware of it, completely removed from it. Then he turns and looks directly at Kalen, who is still on the floor. 20 seconds pass. Cavill appears at Draxen's shoulder and says something low. A report? Updates from outside. But Draxen doesn't break eye contact with Kalen. There's something happening in that look. Something that doesn't fit any category Kalen knows how to name from his time in the trade networks. It isn't assessment for value. It isn't threat analysis. It is, and this is the part Kalen cannot fully understand from the floor of a basement, genuine attention. The kind a man gives something he cannot yet explain. Prescott's escape route confirms what the device already suggested. This was not a street-level hit. No freelance crew plants pressure triggers under a steel table and stages an exit corridor. This was internal, connected to someone with building access, meeting schedules, security sweep patterns. Corporate warfare, moving through the blood of the syndicate like something invisible, looking for the right moment to take the head. And the only reason it failed was because of a mute Omega who noticed a wire. Draxen takes 2 steps forward. He crouches down. Actually crouches, which causes a visible ripple of shock through every man still in the room, bringing himself level with Kalen. He says 2 words. Quiet. Direct. No performance in them at all. You're coming with me. Not a question. Not a threat. The kind of statement that reorders the world around it. Kalen holds Draxen's gaze for one long moment, and somewhere in the back of the room, still watching, one of the lieutenants takes out his phone and sends a message. A message that travels fast. To someone who is already gone. To someone who now knows the Omega is no longer disposable. To someone who will need to act quickly. The suite is on the 14th floor. Clean lines. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A view of the city grid stretching east until it blurs into distance. The kind of room that exists in a different category entirely from the basement 2 hours earlier. The difference is almost violent in its contrast. Kalen stands near the window and doesn't touch anything. He is used to being moved from place to place and told nothing. He is used to rooms that come with instructions attached. This room has no instructions. No chains. No orders written on a notepad and pushed under the door. Just space and quiet and the distant sound of the city doing what cities do. He isn't sure what to do with quiet that doesn't come with a cost. Draxen enters the room without knocking. It's his building, and sets a folder on the table. He doesn't sit. He opens it and fans 3 documents across the surface. Then he steps back. Tell me what you see. Kalen watches him for a moment. Then he walks to the table. The documents are financial routing tables, distribution chains for what appears to be a construction logistics company. Nothing about them looks suspicious at first. The numbers are clean. The names are generic. The formatting is standard. But Kalen starts at the beginning and moves slow. His eyes move left to right, then back, then jump. He's not reading linearly. He's reading the way his father taught him, pulling on the threads that feel wrong before he understands why they feel wrong. There. A vendor code that repeats on 3 separate distribution lines but is attributed to 3 different corporate entities. The kind of thing that could be a data entry error, except it appears in the same sequence each time, always third in the rotation, always just below the threshold that triggers a secondary audit. Not an error. Pattern. He picks up the pen from the table and circles it. 3 circles. Connected by a line his pen draws across the columns. Draxen leans forward. For a long moment he says nothing. Then, "How fast did you see that?" Kalen taps the page twice. Meaning, immediately. Draxen straightens. He looks at Kalen the way he looked at the ceiling mount in the basement, calculating the full dimension of something he only partially understood before. And something shifts in the room. Not dramatically. Not with any announcement. Just a quiet recalibration. The kind that happens when a man who is used to being the most observant person in any space realizes he's been standing next to someone who operates in an entirely different register. Over the next 4 hours, Draxen brings more documents. Shipping records, corporate ownership filings, real estate transfers, insurance portfolios. Each time, Kalen finds the thread. Not always immediately. Sometimes he sits with a page for several minutes before the pattern resolves itself. But it always does. And each time it does, Draxen makes a note on his own pad and adds it to a growing structure of connections that is slowly, piece by piece, becoming a map. They don't speak. There is no need. By the time the city outside the windows has gone from orange dusk to full dark, the table is covered in marked pages and Draxen is staring at something that wasn't visible 3 hours ago. A financial network that reaches from the syndicate's shipping operations up into 3 board-level executives in the virile corporate division. The assassination attempt wasn't an isolated act. It was a move in a longer game. Cavill enters just before midnight and reports that Prescott Hale was stopped at a secondary checkpoint on the south side of the city. Alive, in custody. He says something quietly in Draxen's ear that Draxen receives without expression. Then Cavill looks at Kalen. He doesn't say anything, but the look carries weight. The kind of weight that comes from a man recalibrating something he thought he already understood. Draxen walks him out. In the hallway, their voices drop too low to hear through the door. Kalen stands at the window. The city moves below, indifferent and enormous. And somewhere in the reflection of the glass, he catches a detail that doesn't fit. A small red, moving across the window frame, finding the center of his chest. Kalen drops. The glass behind him shatters inward. A clean hole, high velocity, coming from somewhere across the street, and a single round buries itself in the wall where he was standing. The door blows open. Guards pour in. And from the floor, Kalen looks up at the ceiling and breathes once. Slow, before the second thought settles into place. Someone already knew where he was, which meant the network was still active, and the person they had in custody wasn't the one running it. The bullet hole in the suite wall is still smoking when Draxen makes the call. Not to law enforcement, not to a hospital, to one man, a forensic financial investigator named Broderick Osei who operates out of a private office in the financial district and answers to no agency, no firm, and no government. A man who spent 15 years inside federal securities fraud units before deciding the law moved too slowly and the private sector paid better. Broderick is on site within 40 minutes. He walks into the suite, looks at the shattered window, looks at the bullet path, looks at Kalen sitting in the corner with a shallow cut across his left forearm from the glass, and says nothing. Just opens his laptop and gets to work. Draxen points to the documents spread across the table. The marked pages, Kalen's circled patterns and the pencil lines connecting them across 3 separate corporate structures. Broderick studies it for 90 seconds. Then he says quietly, "This is bigger than one board member. That matters, because Prescott Hale was in custody. The chain should have gone quiet. Instead, someone had a sniper, positioned across the street within 2 hours of the suite assignment, which meant the order to eliminate Kalen had come from above Prescott. Someone who was already watching. Someone who had been watching long before tonight." Broderick pulls up a corporate registry database and starts running the vendor codes Kalen flagged. The first trace takes 11 minutes. It lands on a holding company registered in Delaware with no public-facing employees and a mailing address that belongs to a mailbox service in Midtown. Standard enough. Empty enough. Until Broderick traces the ownership chain through 4 layers of shell structure and finds a name at the bottom. Garrison Tull, Senior Vice President of Strategic Development. Viral Holdings. Not a board member. The man directly above board members. Draxen's jaw tightens. Just slightly. Just once. Then it relaxes. "How long?" he asks. Broderick scrolls. Traces cross-references. Financial positioning started 31 months ago. The shipping irregularities Kalen found are consistent with the diversion scheme, routing syndicate revenue into private accounts under the holding company's umbrella. He pauses. He's been building a war chest. 31 months. 2.5 years of quiet movement, right inside the organization, while everyone looked outward for threats that never came from outside. Kalen is at the table now. He found a clean notepad in the desk drawer and he's writing. Not words, but a diagram. He sketches the structure from memory. The vendor codes, the rotation pattern, the 3 corporate entities, the way the money moved between them in a sequence that always triggered just below the audit threshold. He slides the diagram to Broderick without comment. Broderick looks at it, then looks at Kalen. "How long did it take you to map this?" Kalen holds up 4 fingers. 4 hours. He shakes his head, holds up 1 finger, then taps the diagram. Once through the documents. 1 pass. Broderick leans back in his chair and doesn't say anything for a moment. Draxen watches Kalen from across the table with the expression of a man who has just realized the most important asset in the room wasn't the one he arrived with. They work through the night. By 3 in the morning, the financial map is complete. Garrison Tull had been systematically liquidating syndicate infrastructure, redirecting assets, rerouting revenue streams, positioning himself to step into a power vacuum the moment the Viral brothers were removed. The assassination wasn't about revenge. It wasn't personal. It was a corporate acquisition strategy. Kill the leadership. Absorb the empire. Present the board with a fait accompli. Broderick compiles the documentation into a secured file package. 14 separate evidence threads, each independently verifiable, each connecting to the next in a chain that would hold up to legal scrutiny. He sends it to 3 separate encrypted locations and gives Draxen the access codes. "What's your move?" Broderick asks. Draxen looks at Kalen. Kalen writes 1 word on his notepad and turns it to face them. "Public." Draxen reads it, nods once. Then he picks up his phone and calls his event coordinator, because Garrison Tull had RSVP'd to the Shilla Hotel Gala in 9 days. And he had no idea what was waiting for him there. 9 days is a short runway. Draxen moves fast but quietly. No announcements. No visible increased security. No pattern change that would signal to Garrison Tull's network that anything had shifted. The syndicate's external behavior stays exactly the same, because the moment Tull suspects exposure, he disappears. And a man like Tull, 31 months of careful construction, a sniper on standby within hours, does not disappear without first burning everything behind him. So the operation becomes a surface. Smooth, calm. unremarkable. Underneath it, everything is moving. Kalen works alongside Broderick during the day and reviews security footage at night. He doesn't sleep much. He doesn't complain about it. Sleep has always been a secondary concern to him, a luxury that other people had in other lives. What he has instead is clarity, and clarity compounds in the quiet hours when the building goes still and the only sound is the hum of the city 12 floors below. He finds two more things that nobody else had flagged. The first is a communication pattern. Tull's corporate calendar, obtained through a legal subpoena Broderick moved through a contact judge in under 24 hours, shows a recurring private lunch, listed as a client development meeting, that occurs on the same day of the month as every major syndicate operation review. The timing isn't coincidence. Tull was briefing someone outside the organization, a second party, possibly an investor or a buyer, someone waiting to inherit what the assassination was supposed to create. Kalen circles the dates on a printed calendar and passes it to Draxon with a single underline. Draxon looks at it for a long time. He had a buyer lined up. Kalen nods once, which means the gala isn't just a confrontation. It's a deadline. If Tull doesn't make his move at or before the gala, his buyer walks. 31 months of positioning, gone. Which means Tull will attempt something at the event, not wait for a second opportunity. He's already past the point where patience is an option. This is important. It changes the security plan entirely. Zoran and Cavill are briefed behind closed doors. Kalen is present for the meeting, not standing in the back, not waiting in a hallway, but seated at the table. Cavill doesn't comment on it directly, but his eyes move to Kalen twice during the briefing, and both times there's something in them that wasn't there a week ago. Respect isn't always spoken. Sometimes it just shows up in where a man looks when the serious conversation starts. The gala security plan takes 3 days to finalize. 12 plainclothes operatives distributed across the ballroom, service corridors, and parking structure. A secondary evidence display system installed in the hotel's AV infrastructure. Broderick's work, clean and invisible until activated. Law enforcement contacts briefed at the federal level, standing by off-site, ready to move on signal. On day 6, Kalen senses something is off. He can't point to a single thing. It's the accumulation of small details. A car he's seen 3 times on the same block. A service vendor at the hotel who couldn't answer a basic question about the catering company he claimed to work for. A timestamp on one of Tull's internal communications that puts him in a building 2 miles from his logged office location. He writes it all down and passes it to Draxon. Draxon reads it slowly. "You think he knows we're moving?" Kalen writes. "Not certain, but possible." Draxon looks at the window. Outside, the city runs its usual noise. Then we move faster. He accelerates the evidence compilation. Broderick works a double shift. The federal contact is updated with a preliminary package. And on the evening before the gala, Draxon sits in the quiet of the suite and looks at Kalen across the table where a week's worth of work is stacked in neat evidence folders. He asks the question simply the way he asks all his questions. "If you could leave this place after this is done, would you?" Kalen picks up the pen. He writes 4 words. "Not until it's finished." Draxon reads it. For a moment, he looks like a man who wants to say something and then decides the moment doesn't need it. He stands, nods once. "Then tomorrow we finish it." Across the city, in a private office on the 38th floor of a building that doesn't carry his name, Garrison Tull ends a phone call and sits very still in the dark. He picks up a separate phone, the one with no registered number, no carrier trace, no history. He makes one call. 3 words. Activate the secondary. The Shilla Hotel stands like money made visible. 42 stories of glass and steel on the north end of the financial corridor. Its lobby a cathedral of white marble and indirect lighting. Its ballroom a space that has hosted 4 governors, 2 cabinet secretaries, and more corporate deals than any courthouse in the city. Tonight, the valet line stretches half a block. The guest list runs to 300 names: politicians, executives, international investors, foundation heads. The kind of room where everyone is performing for everyone else and the real conversations happen in corners and coat rooms. Draxon arrives at 9:15, with Kalen beside him. Not behind him, not back with the vehicles. Beside him, in a charcoal suit that Draxon had arranged without comment 3 days earlier, moving through the lobby entrance with the quiet authority of a man who belongs exactly where he is. The room notices. That's an understatement. The room goes through several silent calculations in the space of about 4 seconds. Who is the man beside Draxon Viral? Why is he wearing that suit? Why does he walk like that? And what does it mean that the most feared alpha in the Northern Territories just brought him through the front door, as though the answer to all of those questions is obvious? It is not obvious. That's the point. Zoran is already inside, positioned near the east entrance. Cavill circulates near the bar, drink in hand, unhurried. 12 plainclothes operatives hold their positions across the floor. 2 federal agents in formal wear stand near the AV station. Broderick is in the hotel's server room with a direct line to the display system. Everything is in place. And Garrison Tull is already in the ballroom. Kalen spots him within 90 seconds of entering. West side, champagne flute in his right hand. Standing with a cluster of 3 men in a loose conversation formation that is designed to look casual and is not casual at all. It is the body language of a man running surveillance on the room while pretending to socialize. Tull is 61 years old, silver-haired, built like someone who played competitive sports in college and never stopped training after. The kind of man whose handshake tells you something about his need to establish dominance in the first 3 seconds of meeting anyone. He hasn't seen Draxon yet, or he's pretending he hasn't. Kalen watches him from across the room while Draxon accepts a greeting from a state senator, who moves in with a handshake and a practiced smile. The conversation takes 4 minutes. Draxon is fully present for it. Never looking toward Tull, never signaling, never letting his attention break in a way that would register on a careful observer. Kalen watches instead, and after 7 minutes of watching, he notices the problem. Tull keeps glancing toward the service corridor door on the north wall. Not the ballroom exits. Not the main entrance. The service corridor specifically, the door that connects to the hotel's back infrastructure, the kitchen access, the loading dock. He's timing something. Kalen reaches into his jacket pocket and pulls out a small card. The kind of blank note card that sits in hotel suites beside the phone. He writes 3 words and holds it low, angled toward Zoran's position across the room. North service door. Zoran picks it up in his peripheral vision and gives no visible response. But 20 seconds later, one of the plainclothes operatives near the bar shifts position, crossing the floor in a wide arc, unhurried, wine glass in hand, and settles into a new spot 10 feet from the north service door. That matters, because 3 minutes after that, a man Kalen doesn't recognize exits the service corridor and moves into the ballroom, dressed as a hotel staff member, moving with the practiced invisibility of someone trained to blend into service roles. He carries a tray of champagne flutes and heads directly toward the AV station on the far wall. Not toward guests, toward the display system. Kalen is already moving. He doesn't run. He doesn't call out. He crosses the ballroom floor in a straight line, steady, measured, and steps in front of the man 2 seconds before he reaches the AV station. The man stops. His eyes go flat. He looks at Kalen the way people always look at Kalen when they expect no resistance, and then something shifts in his expression when he realizes resistance is exactly what he's getting. The champagne tray tilts. A plainclothes operative appears at the man's left shoulder. Another at his right. The tray goes down. The man goes still. And across the ballroom, Garrison Tull watches it happen from the west wall with the expression of a man watching something he cannot stop and cannot run from and cannot pretend away. Draxon turns from his conversation and looks directly at Tull. For one long moment, across 300 people in formal wear and champagne and carefully constructed performances, the 2 men look at each other. Tull's hand moves toward his jacket. Kalen sees it from 15 feet away. Draxen raises one hand. Not toward Tull. Toward the AV station. One open palm, a single deliberate gesture, and Broderick activates the system from the server room. The display screens at 6 positions across the ballroom wall come alive simultaneously. Not dramatic, not flashy, just information clear and fully formed, appearing on every screen in the room like a wall that had always been there and just became visible. Financial records. Corporate ownership chains traced through 4 shell layers to a Delaware holding company. Wire transfer histories spanning 31 months. Insurance fraud documentation covering 4 separate syndicate operations. Prescott Hale's signed testimony, recorded 2 days earlier in a secure federal facility, describing in direct, unambiguous language exactly who gave him the order to plant the device in the basement. One name on every screen, Garrison Tull. The room goes quiet in a way ballrooms almost never go quiet. Not the polite quiet of a speech beginning, but the compressed, airless quiet of 300 people processing something they cannot explain away. Tull's hand stops. He doesn't reach for whatever was inside his jacket. He looks at the screens, looks at Draxen, looks at the exits which are now covered. Not visibly, not loudly, but covered. And some part of him understands this because his shoulders shift with the specific weight of a man recognizing that every door out of a room has already been closed. 4 federal agents move in from the perimeter. No running, no chaos, no gunshots. Just 4 men in formal wear who produce credentials at exactly the same moment and converge on Tull from separate angles with the quiet efficiency of people who have done this before and plan to do it correctly. Tull looks at Draxen one more time. His mouth opens. Nothing comes out. The agents reach him. There is a brief, low exchange. Tull's champagne flute is set on the nearest table. Carefully, almost gently. And he is walked toward the east exit with no visible force and no visible resistance and the kind of controlled finality that ends things. The ballroom takes 30 seconds to start breathing normally again. Then it does what rooms full of powerful people always do when something enormous has happened directly in front of them. It starts talking, quietly, in clusters, with that particular electric energy of people who are witnesses to something they will spend years describing at dinners and conferences and private meetings, each of them slightly adjusting the story each time until they place themselves closer to the center of it than they actually were. Kalen stands near the AV station. He watches it all. He watches the federal agents complete their work. Watches Broderick's evidence package being received by 2 additional officers near the east wall. Watches Zoran and Cavill exchange a look across the room that carries the weight of men who just watched something that was supposed to be impossible become finished. He doesn't feel the surge of something that he expected to feel. What he feels instead is quieter than that. The kind of still that comes after something true has finally been said out loud after a long time of being unspoken. A senator approaches Draxen, then an executive, then a foundation director. The room recalibrates in real time the way rooms full of powerful people always do, lining up behind the side that just won, as though they were always there. Kalen watches that too. He knows what it is. He doesn't hold it against anyone. People organize themselves around power. That's just how rooms work. What's different tonight is that the power in this room was found by someone nobody in this ballroom would have looked for it in. A quiet man in a charcoal suit who cannot speak, who noticed a wire in a basement, who saw a face go slack for half a second, who circled a vendor code in a document that 20 other people had already read and marked clean. Victory isn't always the loudest moment in the room. Sometimes it's just the moment the truth becomes too visible to ignore. Later, much later, when the ballroom has thinned to half its count and the federal team has completed their initial work and the night has settled into something closer to its own weight, Draxen walks to the window where Kalen is standing. He doesn't say anything for a moment, just stands there beside him looking out at the city. Then he asks the question, quietly, no performance in it. What do you want now? Kalen looks at the city for a long time. Then he picks up the note card from the window ledge, The same kind he's been using all week, and writes. He holds it up. Draxen reads it again. And this time, when he looks at Kalen, there is something in his expression that has no category. Not gratitude, not strategy. Something older than both of those things. He nods once, and the city outside keeps going, indifferent and enormous and completely unaware of what just changed inside it. If the story moved you, if you've ever been the quietest person in a room full of loud power, drop a comment and tell us what you took from Kalen's story. And if you believe silence can be the strongest voice of all, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. 3 weeks after the gala, Garrison Tull is formally indicted on 12 counts. Wire fraud, financial conspiracy, attempted murder, racketeering, the kind of charge sheet that gets read aloud in a courtroom and takes 4 minutes just to list. His legal team is expensive and aggressive and ultimately irrelevant. Broderick's evidence package is the kind of documentation that doesn't have gaps, because it was built by someone who understood exactly where the gaps are usually hidden. Tull's buyer, the outside investor who had been waiting 31 months for a syndicate handover, withdraws quietly and completely. No press release, no statement, just gone, the way money moves when it wants to stop being associated with something. The virile corporate board undergoes a restructuring that takes 10 days and removes 4 additional executives whose financial activity cross-referenced with Tull's network. 2 of them resign before they're asked. 1 tries to negotiate. 1 says nothing and lets his attorney do the talking. None of it matters much. The structure is gone. Draxen dismantles the Omega trade routes that Tull's network had been using as a secondary revenue channel. Quietly, methodically, the way you dismantle something you want to be sure doesn't grow back. He doesn't announce it. He doesn't hold a press conference. He just closes the doors and reroutes the infrastructure and the routes stop moving. For Kalen, the changes come in a different order. First, a legal identity. A document attorney that Draxen retained works through the formal process. Name registration, identification, the basic architecture of existing as a recognized person in a system that had previously categorized him as property. Takes 11 days. When the documents arrive, Kalen holds them for a long time without moving. Then the suite. No chains. No rotation to a new location. No handler checking in twice a day to make sure he hadn't done anything inconvenient. Just a room that is his in a building that is secure with a standing arrangement that asks nothing of him except that he keeps doing what he does. Watching. Seeing what others miss. The formal title comes from Cavill, actually, not Draxen. Cavill, who had looked at Kalen twice during the briefing 8 days before the gala and recalibrated something he'd already decided. He draws up a 1-page document. No ceremony. No speech. Just a sheet of paper slid across the table one morning that uses the word advisor in the first line and gives Kalen a standing seat at every strategic meeting going forward. Kalen reads it once, signs it, sets it on the table, then picks up a pen and goes back to the shipping manifest he was reviewing. Because there is still work to do. There is always still work to do. Draxen walks past the table that evening and sees the signed document sitting to the side and Kalen 3 pages deep into a new set of financial records, the pen moving in slow, deliberate circles around things that nobody else would think to look for. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't need to. People spend a lot of time believing that power belongs to the loudest person in any room. The one with the most force, the most presence, the most noise. The one who commands the most space and fills the most air and makes sure everyone in the room knows they are there. But history tells a different story. Again and again, the empires that survive, the ones that don't collapse from the inside out, are saved by the ones who simply see the truth before anyone else does. Not because they were the strongest, not because they were the loudest, because they were paying attention when nobody thought it mattered. That night in the basement, when a silent Omega knelt on the concrete floor and heard a sound that was almost nothing, a thin metallic tick that every trained soldier in that room had missed, the world didn't change loudly. It changed in a fraction of a second. In the space between a sound and a decision, In the gap where most people hear nothing and one person hears everything. The quietest mind in the room turned out to be the one that saved the kingdom. And the kingdom has never been the same since. If Kalen's story moved something in you today, if you believe that the quietest person in the room can carry the most power, leave a comment and tell us what you took from this story. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that being overlooked is not the same as being powerless. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about strength that doesn't shout, about survival that doesn't beg, about power that moves in silence, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Every story we bring you is built to do one thing: remind you what strength actually looks like. Don't miss the next one.